In 2014, I created OXIDE, a collection of composited photographs depicting a fictional location. It was sort of meant to be a movie set in search of a screenplay. For 35 years, I was a professor of art at the University of Oregon, where I taught digital arts courses. One class I taught focused on digital photographic imagery. While my own photography consisted of pictures of a straight camera vision style, I noticed that many of my students were drawn to fabricated imagery, primarily made through compositing multiple images and/or text in Photoshop. While not needed for my own work, I decided to learn more about these techniques so I could teach them more effectively. For a number of years, I had been working on a series of pictures made in the Willamette Valley, Oregon, titled Someplace Else. Many pictures featured a central empty area. These were often pictures of signs or buildings. Though not intended for compositing, many of them were perfect prospects. To get started, I decided to composite unlikely words derived from scientific terminology into my Someplace Else pictures. I'm not sure why I chose to do this. Perhaps it was a tribute to my unfulfilled desire as a youth to be a scientist. To my surprise, I enjoyed making these pictures. As a matter of fact, I was captivated by the technique and intrigued by the images. Once I gained the desired skills, I had no reason to make more pictures, but I continued anyway. At that time, I had also been thinking about creating a fictional blog that would appear to be written by a photographer who was earnest but not so talented. He would have humorous adventures and would be accompanied by his dog Pal. In 2008, I began writing and posting to the blog. I named the photographer Payne Fresco. Payne was derived from a personal family name, and Fresco to make his name sound like the phrase fresh bread in French, which for some reason I thought would be funny. I needed illustrations for the blog, so I started to make composited photographs. At one point, I made the storyline allow the scientific terminology pictures to fit into the plot. Some of the inspiration and source material for OXIDE originally came from developments in the Payne Fresco blog. Here's a short excerpt from the blog where Payne discovers Oxide City. Brother, a lot has happened since my last post. First of all, I have found an ideal location for my university. I stumbled upon it by accident. A couple of days ago, I was out with Pal taking pictures. He saw a squirrel and went running. Since he had the Palocam on, which takes a picture whenever he barks, he returned with some startling photos. They were of a place I had never seen before. I thought I knew this area as well as the back of my hand, but this was new. I asked Pal to show me where he had been, and he took off. I followed him through some very dense blackberry bushes. I was able to follow him because, by coincidence, that day I was wearing my blackberry suit. It's an invention of mine that allows me to walk inside thickets of blackberries and get the berries other people can't. It looks kind of like a beekeeper's outfit. When I came out on the other side, it was like I was in a different town. As it turns out, this was Oxide City. When the state highway bypassed downtown, businesses moved over to the highway. Eventually, blackberry vines formed an almost impenetrable barrier to the old town, and the new town was renamed Hazelnut Springs. After a number of months and a bunch of posts, I ended the blog. I was finding that creating pictures that didn't need to fit into a plot, but could stand on their own, was more interesting. Perhaps the most important quality I wanted pictures in OXIDE to have was for all composites to depict a scene that could almost happen, but not quite. Things needed to be just a little off-kilter. I was not trying to create the bizarre, but rather the curious. While making the Someplace Else pictures, I would occasionally find and photograph puzzling visual events in the real world. In some ways, it was more interesting not knowing their story, but to savor the mystery. In the OXIDE photographs, I wanted to create my own mysteries. Here are a few examples of the background pictures before my additions and then with them. At first, I intended the series to be pictures presented on a screen or as inkjet prints. Eventually, I realized a book could also make an excellent form for OXIDE to take. At first, I thought OXIDE would be the fourth in a series of artist books I did that juxtaposed text and image. The publications were Signal to Noise from 1988, Dry Reading from 1991, and Mars Observations from 2001. In the first OXIDE prototypes, I surrounded the pictures with computer-generated text. The text was derived from a randomized list of paint color names. I made a few print-on-demand prototypes of the book in this form, but after a number of tries, I decided that OXIDE wanted to be a picture book without text. In 2013, I was offered an exhibition of OXIDE at Blue Sky Gallery in Portland. This seemed like a good time to go ahead and print the book. I have been involved in publication production over the years and was familiar with the mechanics of putting a book together and getting it printed. This meant I didn't need to depend on a publisher. I also knew it was unlikely a publisher would take on such a quirky project. To find a quality printer, I relied on information from a friend who told me about a printer in Hong Kong that an important photo book publisher they knew of used. I contacted the printer and got a quote. In a leap of faith, I sent a large check off to Hong Kong and started the final project. Despite a few minor problems, working with the printer went well. Here's a picture of the pallets of books along with a Facebook post I made at the time. In 2014, OXIDE was shown at Blue Sky Gallery, and here's a picture from the opening. Blue Sky sent copies of OXIDE out as a member benefit, and a few copies were sold here and there. The real problem was distribution. For books printed on a printing press, the first copy costs a fortune, but as the press run increases, the cost per copy goes down dramatically. Because of this, I made the decision to print 2,000 copies. As it turns out, even though many copies ended up out in the world, this was way too many, and as they say, my book was a million seller. I have a million of them in my cellar. I sent a bunch of copies to galleries, museums, and other arts organizations. I received many letters back and feel it received a good critical response. OXIDE also received a few reviews. One of the best was published in the important art blog Hyperallergic. Allison Meyer writes, "A silhouette of a ballerina is fading on an abandoned semi-truck. A sign for Lover's Lane warns of falling rocks and high water. And not a person is around. What is this strange and desolate landscape?" She goes on to say, "Some of the work is more obviously fiction than others, but where it works best is when, out of the context of OXIDE, you might not realize it was a fabrication. All over cities and towns are these ghost signs and typography for vanished businesses that often appear as cryptic messages, the advertisements having outlived the products. The composite images are whimsically strange, but enjoyable to browse as a visual detective in what feels like a post-apocalyptic puzzle." Altogether, I made about 200 pictures for OXIDE, and about 150 of them made it into the book. Let's take a little tour of OXIDE and look at some of the pictures. Thanks for watching. If you want to know more about my projects, visit my website, dryreading.com, and check out my YouTube channel.